first thing Hezekiah did to restore godly worship in Judah? This is the question we seek to answer today as we continue our verse-by-verse study of the book of 2 Chronicles on Walking Through the Bible.
The glory of his cross.
Today we're going to be discussing 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verses 20 to 36. But before we do that, let's read the passage. If you have a Bible with you, turn to 2 Chronicles chapter 29, verse 20. But if you don't have a Bible, don't worry, just follow along with us on the screen. The version that we'll be reading from is the New King James Version. So 2 Chronicles chapter 29, beginning at verse 20. Then King Hezekiah rose early, gathered the rulers of the city, and went up to the house of the Lord. And they brought 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats for a sin offering for the kingdom, for the sanctuary, and for Judah. Then he commanded the priests, the sons of Aaron, to offer them on the altar of the Lord. So they killed the bulls, and the priests received the blood and sprinkled it on the altar. Likewise, they killed the rams and sprinkled the blood on the altar. They also killed the lambs and sprinkled the blood on the altar. Then they brought out the male goats for the sin offering before the king and the assembly, and they laid their hands on them. And the priests killed them, and they presented their blood on the altar as a sin offering to make an atonement for all Israel. For the king commanded that the burnt offering and the sin offering be made for all Israel. And he stationed the Levites in the house of the Lord with cymbals, with stringed instruments, and with harps, according to the commandment of David, of Gad the king's seer, and of Nathan the prophet. And thus was the commandment of the Lord by his prophets. The Levites stood with the instruments of David, and the priests with the trumpets. Then Hezekiah commanded them to offer the burnt offerings on the altar. And when the burnt offerings began, the song of the Lord also began, with the trumpets and with the instruments of David, king of Israel. So all the assembly worshipped. The singers sang, and the trumpeters sounded. All this continued until the burnt offering was finished. And when they had finished offering, the king and all who were present with him bowed and worshipped. Moreover, King Hezekiah and the leaders commanded the Levites to sing praise to the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. So they sang praises with gladness, and they bowed their heads and worshipped. Then Hezekiah answered and said, Now that you have consecrated yourselves to the Lord, come near and bring sacrifices and thank offerings into the house of the Lord. So the assembly brought in sacrifices and thank offerings, and as many as were of a willing heart brought burnt offerings. And the number of the burnt offerings which the assembly brought was 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. All these were for a burnt offering to the Lord. The consecrated things were 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. But the priests were too few, so that they could not skin all the burnt offerings. Therefore, their brethren the Levites helped them until the work was ended, and until the other priests had sanctified themselves, for the Levites were more diligent in sanctifying themselves than the priests. Also the burnt offerings were in abundance, with the fat of the peace offerings, and with the drink offerings for every burnt offering. So the service of the house of the Lord was set in order. Then Hezekiah and all the people rejoiced that God had prepared the people, since the events took place so suddenly. Hezekiah is now the king of Judah. This chapter and the next actually take place while he is co-reigning with Ahaz, his father, but Hezekiah seemed to be the one in control, as Judah had fallen into a state of decline because of Ahaz's wickedness. Hezekiah was a righteous king, like David was, meaning that he was a king that not only was righteous himself, but he cared that the people were righteous too. We're going to find that he would wipe out the idols from the land and remove the high places, something that many of the past righteous kings in Judah were unable to do. The first order of business, though, was restoring the temple worship. Recall under Ahaz that he actually closed the temple and desecrated it. Hezekiah could see this desecration outside his bedroom window, for if he lived in the king's palace, that was right next door to the temple. And so Hezekiah called the Levites and the priests together, as they were the ones who could re-sanctify the temple, as they were the ones tasked with caring for the temple. And this they did in 16 days. All of this occurred in the first month of the year, corresponding to our late March, early April. Well, what was also special about this month is that it was supposed to be the Passover month. However, since the work wasn't commanded to be done until the beginning of the month, for that seems to be when Hezekiah ascended to the throne, it couldn't be completed in time for the Passover that year. We'll see in chapter 30 what results from that. But with the temple now cleansed, and the priests and Levites sanctified for the work in the temple, we'll get to more about that in a moment, now was the time for the temple worship to begin again. And that's what we find going on in verses 20 to 36. It starts with Hezekiah gathering the rulers of the city together along with an assembly from among the nation of Judah in order to offer sacrifices to God and offer songs of praise to him. Of utmost importance to begin with was the sin sacrifices. Hezekiah rightly understood that the nation as a whole had sinned against God, and therefore God was angry with them and wouldn't hear their prayers and their praise while they remained in such a state. So, 7 bulls, 7 rams, 7 lambs, and 7 male goats were offered. If you go back to Leviticus 4 and read that on your own time, you'd recognize that what Hezekiah was doing was offering a sin sacrifice for each category listed there: the priests, the entire congregation, the ruler, and the common people. That's why the different kinds of animals were brought. The number 7 in Scripture oftentimes has to do with completeness, and so if that was the intent here, Hezekiah was wanting God to completely forgive the sins of the people. The priests thus offered the sin sacrifice according to the prescribed manner. Then Hezekiah moved on to the burnt offering, an offering of complete dedication and surrender to God. In total, the number of the burnt offerings that were offered were 70 bulls, 100 rams, and 200 lambs. While the burnt offering was being offered, Hezekiah desired that the musicians of the temple were to sing psalms, some of which we would find in the book of Psalms, as well as play instruments, as this was the proscribed worship of the temple. It is said that all the assembly worshipped along with the singers and the trumpeters, showing us that worship involved everyone. And it continued until the burnt offering was completely offered. After this, the peace offerings were offered by the people, totaling 600 bulls and 3,000 sheep. The peace offering was a voluntary offering of the people, an offering of thanksgiving to God for all that he had done for them, and an offering that the people offering it could share in. So numerous were their offerings on this occasion, the priests were too few, and so needed the help of the other Levites in skinning the offerings. By this, I don't believe the chronicler is saying the Levites offered the offerings on the altar, just that they assisted in preparing the animal for offering. The primary reason was that there were too many animals and too few priests, but there is a secondary reason given, which was there were too few priests because not all of the priests had sanctified themselves yet, and so couldn't participate. We're told that the Levites were more diligent than the priests in sanctifying themselves, showing us the state of moral decline that Judah had been in during the reign of Ahaz, that caused some of the priesthood not to be as diligent as others. So it was not just the number of animals that was overwhelming, it was the lack of sanctified priests as well that created a problem. This deviation from regular practice was momentary, not habitual, and seemingly accepted by God, for nobody was struck dead or struck with diseases in the process, something we've seen in the past. This lack of priests, though, is a foreshadowing of something we'll discuss in chapter 30, so we invite you back for those lessons. With the service of the Lord now restored and set in order, and the people having rejoiced that God was obviously now with them, for they said God had prepared the people for this since the events took place so suddenly, the time was right to restore other things about religious life in Judah. Events we'll start to cover, the Lord willing, in the next lesson. With that, our time is up for today. The Lord willing, we hope you'll join us for tomorrow's discussion of 2 Chronicles chapter 30, verses 1 to 12, as we continue our walk through the Bible, one verse at a time. Thank you for watching today's episode. We hope that you found it edifying and ask that you not only subscribe to our channel and podcast, but that you like and share this episode among your friends, so that the saving gospel of Jesus Christ can go out to the whole world.
Of his